Our lesson for today will be looking at grade 12. The topic for today is organic chemistry, lesson 101. Let us start. Normally we say this chapter is organic molecules instead of organic chemistry. But since we have different types of organic molecules with different properties, we can say they all fall under organic chemistry. The first thing that is very important, in this lesson we'll be dealing with only the introduction of this chapter, and we should be also covering the definitions that we'll be using throughout this topic. The first thing, which is very important, what are organic molecules? When you talk about organic molecules, you should know that organic molecules are those molecules that contain carbon atoms. We know that in general chemistry or chemistry, we do have different types of molecules. We can say compounds. Other compounds, they may consist of two or more elements. As long as we have a compound, a molecule that consists of or it contains carbon atoms, you should know that we are talking about an organic molecule. So what is important is to know that organic molecules, they contain carbon atoms. With that being said, let us look at carbon. We know that carbon is in group number 4, and the valence electrons, it has 4 valence electrons. Having 4 valence electrons, it simply means that carbon, it is a tetravalent atom, meaning that it bonds 4 times in order to reach the octet state, which is having 8 electrons on the valence level or valence energy level. So in this case, you can see that it needs 4 electrons in order to have 8 electrons. So that is why we say it is tetravalent atom, because it needs 4. So in order for it to reach the octet state, it needs to bond 4 times. You should also know that we represent bonds using lines. So instead of having these dots, we can simply put lines. Just note that a single line, it has 2 electrons. So carbon can bond in different ways. It can bond using single bonds, which it will bond 4 times using single bonds, or it can bond with a double bond and 2 single bonds, or it can bond triple bond and a single bond. So throughout this lesson video, we are going to be looking at case number 1, 2, 3. Now let us look at the examples of organic molecules. Suppose we have carbon with its valence electrons. It needs to bond 4 times in order to reach octet state. And then we have hydrogen. It's in group number 1, the valence electrons, it has only 1 valent electron. And it needs another electron in order for it to reach the noble state. So in this case, hydrogen can come with its electron here and bond with one of the valence electrons from carbon. And we can see this hydrogen, it has reached the noble state since it needs 2 electrons. When we count the number of valence electrons for this hydrogen, we are going to say 1, 2. But looking at carbon, we can see it is still not happy, or it is still not yet reached the octet state. So we can bring another hydrogen here. This hydrogen is also happy. It is stable. But looking at carbon, it has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Remember we said 8. So we can take another hydrogen and bring it here. Now we have 7. Then we can bring another hydrogen here. So in this case we have 8 valence electrons for carbon, and then we have 2 valence electrons for each hydrogen. And then the molecular formula for this will be CH4. Means we have 1 atom of carbon and we have 4 atoms of hydrogen. We can also represent this using lines. Instead of having this dots, you can simply put lines. Then you can clearly see this is case number 1, actually having carbon bonding 4 times using single bonds. Now we can use case number 2. For case number 2, we can put another carbon here, and then we have those single bonds. In this case, we can also use hydrogen. And then looking at the bonding electrons, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 for this carbon. Since this carbon, it is identical to this one, it simply means it is also having 8 valence electrons. And then the name, actually the molecular formula for this will be C2H4. Since you can see we have 4 hydrogen atoms. Now looking at case number 3, we can still have 2 carbons, then with, let us use a different color, hydrogen. Looking at the electrons, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. It is still the same as, it is identical to this carbon, so it has 8 valence electrons. And these hydrogens, they are also identical, they have 2 valence electrons. The molecular formula, it will be C2H2. Now since we can see that these molecules, the examples that we've done so far, they contain carbon, this simply means they are one of the examples of organic molecules. Now let us look at the term molecular formula. You should know that the molecular formula is a chemical formula that indicates the type of atoms and the correct number of each in a molecule. In our examples, looking at the molecular formula, this is one of the molecular formula. Tells us that we have 1 atom of carbon and 4 atoms of hydrogens. Looking at the second example, this is also a molecular formula. Looking at our third example, this is the molecular formula. Now we know what is a molecular formula. Now let us look at structural formula. You should know that a structural formula is a structural formula of a compound shows which atoms are attached to which within the molecule. Like for example, we can see that this carbon is attached to this carbon using triple bond, and it is also attached to this hydrogen together with this carbon and this hydrogen and the triple bond. So we say this is a structural formula. So we have a structural formula and also a molecular formula. Looking at this example, this is our structural formula, this is our molecular formula. Looking at the next, this structural formula, then this will be our molecular formula. There is another formula that we should know. We call it a condensed structural formula. In this case, the structural formula will be the same as the molecular formula. But looking at the next example, this should be able to explain the structural formula. Looking at the structural formula, we have to look at the summary of the condensed formula. We'll be looking at the summary of the structural formula. So the condensed formula, we start looking at the first carbon. We write C, and then how many hydrogens it has. We have H. How many hydrogens? We have 2. And then looking at the next one, C, and then we put the number of hydrogen it has. So you can clearly see the difference between this and this. This is a condensed formula, and then this is a molecular formula. It is simple. Let us look at the next one. Looking at the condensed formula for this one, we're going to have CH, CH. When we continue with the next lesson video, whereby we'll be looking at different types of homologous series, we will be explaining this condensed formula together with structural formula and molecular formula in detail, meaning that we'll be looking at more examples. Now, before we wrap up this lesson, we do have few terms we need to understand. We have hydrocarbon. We want to know what is a hydrocarbon. A hydrocarbon is organic compounds that consist of hydrogen and carbon only. For example, looking at the first example that we've looked at, and looking at this, you can see the difference between the two. This one, it has carbon and hydrogen only. This one, it has carbon, oxygen, and hydrogen. So we regard this, or we classify this as a hydrocarbon. And then this one, it is not a hydrocarbon since it has oxygen within the molecule. Another term which is very important in the introduction lesson, it's saturated. Saturated compounds. And we do have an inverse of this, which is unsaturated compounds. You should know that saturated compounds are compounds in which there are no multiple bonds between carbon atoms in the hydrocarbon chain. For example, suppose we have these two structures. Remember, we are talking about saturated and unsaturated. According to the definition of saturated compounds, it's compounds in which there are no multiple bonds between carbon atoms. Looking at the first one, between carbon and carbon, there's no double bond. Looking at the second one, it's actually I made a mistake here. Only have this. Between carbon and carbon, we can see that there is a double bond. So this one is a saturated compound. And then obviously this will be unsaturated compound. By the way, the definition of unsaturated compound, it's compound with one or more multiple bonds between carbon atoms in the hydrocarbon chain. Meaning that we do have another unsaturated, which will be like this, having a triple bond between carbon and carbon. This is also unsaturated compound. To go through this again, a compound which there are no multiple bonds between carbon and carbon bond, which is this one, it only has a single bond, it is saturated compound. This one with multiple bonds, which is double bond in this case, it is unsaturated, and also this one, it is unsaturated since it has a triple bond. Now this is the introduction of organic molecules or organic chemistry. In the next lesson video, we'll be starting to look at the first homologous series, which are alkanes. That's it for this lesson video. This is Wahula SJ. Thank you very much.